Layne Hartsell with the Korea IT Times, and I'm here with Frances Coppola, an economist who works on banking specialty and also has written a book on quantitative easing for the people, quite an interesting concept, and also numerous other articles and progressive and so forth in Europe. Frances, thank you for taking your time to be with me today.
Hi, nice to see you.
First of all, as I mentioned when we were talking before the program, the economic system is really in a mess, and it's not just experts talking about it. I mean, regular people can't meet their utility bills, basic expenses. You know, can we talk a little bit about this in a general sense, and then maybe go into specifics like grain and that kind of thing later?
Okay. I mean, economics has been in quite a bit of a mess really since the financial crisis of 2008, and the economics profession has undergone a great deal of soul searching about what went wrong, and not really to any great conclusion, I don't think, because I think we're seeing a further unraveling of the monetarist neoliberal paradigm that has dominated economics really since the 1980s. We're seeing some kind of shift. What that form that will take is not entirely clear, but disturbingly, it does appear that in many countries, the new political paradigm, remember the economics is political. I mean, you can't separate economics from politics really. So the political economy is nationalist. And so we're seeing rising barriers to trade, impediments to the movement of people, interference with movement of capital. That's the effect of sanctions. And all of that adds up to, in many countries, I think, lower growth, shortages, and rising prices. We are seeing the return of inflation because we're creating an economic paradigm which is much more akin to the post-war period, when economies were much more closed. When we had capital controls and exchange controls, where we didn't have the kind of free movement of people that we have now, because we actually didn't have the transport that we have now. Now we're deliberately imposing restrictions. Then it was simply that it was just much more difficult to travel. So when you have that kind of world, you're going to have domestic inflation, because the low inflation we've had really since the 1990s has been driven by liberalization of trade. Cross-border trade, liberalization of movement of people, and the rise of developing countries, notably China, but the Asian economies generally. And that's really what's been keeping inflation down in the West, has been the ability of companies to outsource their production to cheaper places, to pay lower wages there, where there's cheaper labor, and then bring the products back to the West and sell them for higher prices here. Sell them here for relatively low prices compared to the cost of production in the West. And that is what has been keeping inflation down, in my view, since the 1990s. It's known as the Great Moderation. Central banks have been taking credit for it. I am of the opinion it has more to do with the great expansion in the East.
And also, to add on there, subsidies were given, say, from German taxpayers to this particular system. Is that correct?
Well, yes, I mean, well, Germany's economic miracle is fundamentally mercantilist. So what they've done is domestically, they've repressed wages ever since 2004, the Hartz reforms. They've actually domestically repressed wages, except in their export sector, and really focused upon their heavy manufacturing for export. And then lent to other countries to enable them to buy German exports. And they have built a huge export powerhouse on the back of that. That export powerhouse has caused enormous problems for other countries in the Eurozone, because it lent to those other countries in order for them to buy its manufacturing, and then that all went a bit pear-shaped. But in the Eurozone crisis, Germany discovered it couldn't do that to the Eurozone anymore, because the countries it was selling to just couldn't afford it anymore. So it pivoted to China and started lending and selling to China instead. And that's been pretty successful for about 10 years. But now Now we had the pandemic, and now we've got a war, and the whole export model for Germany is falling apart. Not really because no one wants to buy its products anymore, but because the cost of its inputs are rising so much. I mean, Germany has made itself critically dependent upon Russia for energy. And because of that, presumably not expecting Russia to show naked aggression to a country on its borders, to which the West would respond with sanctions. And so Germany, which is resisting the sanctions every step of the way, and it's also resisting arming Ukraine as well, in its own self-interest, is nonetheless facing increasingly high prices for its manufacturing inputs, the energy upon which its manufacturing depends. And that is eroding, well, arguably destroying its export model. It's actually now lost its entire trade surplus for the first time in decades.
Yeah, can we go in this direction just to continue with the general part, and then we can move on, as I said, to like the regular consumer, like ourselves. Mm-hmm. If Germany would have been more hawkish or aggressive at the beginning, I mean, that would have been a problem also, because Russia will say, well, in the last century, we have a history with Germany. Is Scholz standing off, or standing back in a way?
Germany might have been holding back politically because of its history and because of all the rhetoric coming out of Russia about Nazism, which has been one of the major justifications that it's advanced for its invasion of Ukraine, is this view that the Ukrainian regime is Nazi, and a high proportion of the Ukrainian population has been infected with Nazism. So it's understandable that Germany might feel a bit sensitive about backing the Ukrainian regime and arming its people. I can totally understand that, but I do think the major driver is economics rather than politics here.
Okay, so let's say we're going into the cold season, right? So I mean, we're at the end of the summer. Around November, it'll get cold. What can happen in this kind of situation?
We've got winter coming, and certainly in the UK here, an absolutely mammoth rise in energy prices slated for October, and another one in the new year, which an awful lot of people won't be able to afford. I saw a chart, I think, from the Institute of, from the IFS, showing, no, it's from the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, showing that, estimating that it depends where you are in the UK. Obviously, the further north you are, the worse it gets, because the colder it is. That in some areas, up to 3/4 of the population will be in fuel poverty. They won't be able to afford the price rises. And even in London, it could be as much as half the population. So that's an awful lot of people. I mean, the population of the UK is about 66 million people. So we're talking about upwards of 40 million people in fuel poverty. And in Europe, I think it's going to be worse. And the further east you go, the worse it's going to get as well, because an awful lot of countries in the east of Europe are so completely dependent on Russian gas. The UK isn't. So this is more to do with the kind of the way we do things domestically, I think, and the effect of global market prices, rather than a specific dependence on Russia.
Are you getting it from Norway? Where does yours come from?
Yeah, some of it's from Norway. Some of it's our own. Various places. We aren't a huge importer of Russian gas, but it's more that the prices, the global market prices, have risen so much. That's what's driving our energy price. It's kind of a second order effect, if you like, rather than a direct shortage problem such as Germany is going to have. Well, has already. Yeah.
For those listening, I realized that was one of those, I could be criticized for a softball kind of question, but the reason why I asked that simple question is because of the depth of what you're talking about. As you said, it's mammoth. This is not something that's just going to go away, right?
No.
This is
the astonishing thing is how many people are affected.
yes.
I mean, as you know, the UK government is in chaos at the moment, and we don't really have an effective government at the moment, and we've got the Tory leadership candidates fighting it out for who gets the job. But neither of them at the moment seem to have any comprehension of just how many people this affects and how far up the income distribution it goes. So we're talking about middle class people being forced into fuel poverty. It's that bad. Heaven knows how the very poor are going to survive. They're going to die, basically. But even middle income people are going to have to cut back their income, their disposable income quite significantly. And that is going to have knock-on impacts into the rest of the economy. We are facing a recession. I think unless the government does something to relieve the effect of the energy price rises, and to a lesser extent also food price rises, which are affected by global market effects and supply chain disruptions lingering from the pandemic, and also because of Brexit, unless the government does something to relieve all of that, we are going to be facing quite a sharp recession, and one that's going to last for quite a while. And it's not just me saying that. This is actually the Bank of England's forecast.
Yeah, I had written down before I talked to you, as I was thinking about this, I wrote down pandemic, supply chains, war, and inflation. And inflation is something that you said was going to happen. I think I saw you wrote this maybe in 2020, right at March, right?
I did.
Okay, so yeah.
April 2020, I actually said I thought there would be inflation as the economy reopened after the pandemic, because demand would recover faster than supply. The pandemic was immensely disruptive to the supply side, particularly to services, but also to goods, because it was a global pandemic. And so travel, trade, movement of goods and services, movement of people was completely disrupted during the pandemic. No, shipping costs rose to the sky. One of my favorite charts during the pandemic was the Baltic Dry Index, which it tells you the cost of shipping. It went up like a church steeple. And that reflects the cost of moving goods around. We had no air freight for a long time. Right. We had not much train freight for a long time. We had embargoes on driving. You know, it was just immensely difficult to move anything around. And when you disrupt your movement of goods and services and people like that, that has long-lasting knock-on effects on your supply. It takes a long time for those kind of supply disruptions to resolve, and they aren't resolved yet. And of course, we still have pandemic disruptions in parts of the world. So in China, for example, we've still got rolling lockdowns. I think where is it that's locked down at the moment? Somewhere, Wuhan or so. Is it Wuhan again?
Shanghai and Hong Kong just went out of it. But you also made a comment recently that the war is not so much the problem yet. Well, it is a problem, but it was these lockdowns that you were just mentioning, right?
Yeah. So that combined with the fact that rightly, I think, countries decided to support demand during the pandemic, because they were keeping people, to keep people alive, really. We had in the UK, we had the furlough scheme, we had the SAY scheme for self-employed people, which qualifies as helicopter money, actually. In Europe, they had various schemes. The US had the CARES Act, repeated helicopter drops and extension of benefits. All of these kind of schemes, all designed to try and keep people alive during the pandemic. And in the US's case, actually to try and prop up demand, which I think was a mistake. They shouldn't have tried to do that during the pandemic. They should just let demand fall. But trying to keep people alive, trying to make it possible for people to survive, I think was hugely important. For me, and central banks obviously were part of that as well, because they were supporting their governments so that they could do that. The amount of money that central banks have thrown around is unprecedented. And I did find myself thinking, do we really need this much demand stimulus? Isn't it just propping up asset prices? Which of course it was. We had a massive bull run on capital markets, all because of the QEs. I'm not convinced that central banks really got this right. I think they overdid it. I think that governments and central banks got too far away from the batten down the hatches but keep people alive. to get through the pandemic and into the, hey, we've got to get the economy moving. I mean, they actually explicitly said this. And I was thinking, you've still got a pandemic. What are you doing? Stimulating demand while you're shutting down half the economy. This doesn't make any sort of sense. So, and I was quite a lonely voice saying that I thought these were mistakes.
They stimulated demand, but the problem was demand was falling not because of lack of cash, but because people couldn't spend money, right? So then
exactly, and that's why the savings rate. That's why the savings rate rose so much, because people couldn't spend any money. They couldn't go on holiday. They couldn't get their hair cut. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't go to the shops. They just couldn't spend any money. So of course they saved their money.
We created the metaverse now.
Well, yeah, I mean, cryptocurrencies did well. Only that's unraveling quite fast now, isn't it? Which it was always going to.
Yes. I want to ask you about that. But first of all, while we're on this topic, what is the difference between monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus? Many people won't know the difference.
Okay, monetary stimulus is done by central banks. It typically takes the form of some form of intervention with interest rates. So that might be actual explicit changes to interest rates, cuts to interest rates, or it might be some other kind of tool designed to influence market rates by influencing investor behavior. So that's what quantitative easing is. So I know a lot of people think of it as printing money, as putting money into the economy, and it kind of is, but the objective is to depress interest rates along the yield curve. That's the point. And the point of it was to make it cheaper for companies to borrow, to invest. Now that kind of didn't quite happen. I'm very skeptical about QE as it's traditionally done, and I am personally more in favor, generally, when you need a demand stimulus, of helicopter money, because I think it actually goes to the places where it's needed rather than being trickled down. Thrown into financial markets on the expectation that it will somehow trickle down to where it's needed. That's essentially the thesis of my book, is that it would be better if central banks intervene directly. But there is this argument that helicopter money that goes to Main Street instead of Wall Street, is fiscal policy. And it is fair to say that even if the central bank is actually creating the money that you dish out in helicopter drops, the helicopters are flown by the government, because the central bank doesn't know where people are. It doesn't have bank account details and addresses and things like that. So if you're going to do helicopter drops, they've always got to be delivered by the authority that has that information, and that is the government. That's going to be the tax authority or the benefits authority or something like that. And so to have helicopter drops, you have to have coordination between central bank and fiscal authority. Fiscal policy is the government putting money into the economy in some way, whether it's through increased benefits, whether it's through tax cuts, which are a form of stimulus, whether it's through spending, buying goods and services, whether it's through providing incentives to small businesses, these sorts of things. All of these, this is fiscal policy. And also, importantly, and this doesn't get talked about enough, government has a crucial role in what we might say intervening in the structure of markets, making them work properly. Because a completely unregulated market doesn't work properly. The natural tendency of markets is to monopoly. And so if you want to have a market that actually works properly, you have to have a legal framework that makes it, that limits that tendency. In America, that's antitrust legislation. We have equivalent legislation in the UK. The government, a crucial job of the government is the rule of law, is to create the legal frameworks that make it possible for people to transact fairly and equitably with each other, because like I said, naturally, there is no fairness and equity. It is the law of the jungle.
Right, so it's a political economy, not a scientific economy, which actually
absolutely
exists.
Absolutely.
In the case of, say, something like inflation, one problem with the market is that the market can send the signals back to the producers, the manufacturers. We need more vaccines, for example.
Yeah.
But they don't produce more because they're already getting high prices. And if you need something, it's different if it's for tennis rackets, but if it's for vaccines, then you don't get the production that's needed. then you get this, how, I don't know what
Yeah.
Greek letter are we on now of the virus? We don't know, but anyway, you don't
Yeah, I
get the
mean,
production that you need.
this is why competition is so important. You need to have new entrants coming in who can kick the
Right.
incumbents into actually saying, no, we've got to increase production. We need more production. We need to cut our prices. If you don't have that, then prices will carry on upwards. This is why monopolies, when you have monopolies or near monopolies in markets, and you often do in utilities, and we haven't talked about utilities yet, the upwards trajectory on prices is always upwards because there is no competition. There is nothing to bring that price down except regulation and government intervention. That's all there is.
Right.
Yeah,
And that's going to be hated, right? So it's
absolutely. Yeah,
a difficult issue.
it's a
It's
tricky
certainly
one.
highlighted.
Yeah.
It's certainly highlighted by the pandemic, right? Because that's something you have to stop immediately. You can't just play around
Yeah.
with government regulation or the market or whatever. Let's move on to this. There are a couple of things: supply chains, energy. What area would you think is more necessary right now to be talked about in the public, or if we're doing public education, like say for myself, should we be talking about uh, people protesting, how to deal with this coming, as you say, mammoth problem? Uh, how do we deal with it as regular people?
Well, I think part of the fiction, if you like, that we're being given about the economy, the political economy at the moment, is this refusal by the West to acknowledge that we're at war, and wartime economies are inflationary. They always are. So we've imposed upon a major oil and gas producer a package of sanctions that actually is bound to raise oil and gas prices for ourselves. And we're talking about this as if this shouldn't be happening. Well, it's the natural consequence of what we're doing, of the fact that we are choosing to intervene in this war in a particular way to restrict the ability of the aggressor to continue with the war. That's the point of these sanctions. And the effect of that is to hurt us, is to hurt our own people by massively raising energy prices. That's what's going on. And that's what we need to be talking about, is saying, should we really be pretending we're not at war? I don't think we should. I think we're saying we are at war, and therefore we should be treating this as a wartime economic problem. And in a wartime economy, kind of all bets are off, really. I mean, your traditional economics does rather go out the window, because in a wartime economy, and this is a global war, the whole of the West is involved, and the East as well. It disrupts everything. It disrupts your supply. So the other side of this, of course, is disruption to food supplies caused by the fact that the other side in this war is a major food producer. And so food supplies to the rest of the world are bound to be disrupted, and so we are bound to have rising prices. And at the moment, there's no real kind of coordinated action by the West.
Right.
Public action to say, actually, we do need to be looking at ways of ensuring the food supply, particularly to those countries that are most exposed. The United Nations keeps shouting about this.
Yes.
And in the West keeps going, no, we're not at war. No, we're not at war. This isn't a problem. We're just doing some sanctions. And UK, yeah, we'll get some boats through, really. I know we are getting some boats through, but, it's hugely risky. We're kind of in Atlantic convoys territory. I have to say, I do want to give a bit of a shout out to Turkey, actually, which has been so far, despite its friendliness to Russia, so far been playing ball over the straits, over the traffic through the straits.
Let me ask one final question. Are we headed towards some type of post-war kind of order as far as economics goes, Bretton Woods, banking? I mean, is there something like that coming about?
No, I don't see any evidence that there is any such willingness to cooperate, coordinate in the way that they did at Bretton Woods, or even the Plaza Accord of 1985. I'm just not seeing that degree of international cooperation. That's not where it's going. Everything's blowing apart at the moment. It's very much every country for themselves. Even in Europe, even in the EU, there are these huge tensions again with countries saying we're going to do our own thing. You've got Italy potentially going to elect a Eurosceptic government. I mean, you know, and we played that scene before. That's where it's going. I think I said earlier that the emerging political paradigm is nationalist. Nationalist economic paradigm does not lend itself to the kind of Bretton Woods structure, economic cooperation, supranational organizations, cooperation between central banks, cooperation between governments. It doesn't lend itself to that. I would say that if anything, the existing order, the post-Bretton Woods order, is disintegrating, and we are entering a period of chaos.
So it's collapse rather than crisis, more leaning, if we don't really know, but I keep seeing this too from other experts, you know.
Yeah.
They tend to think that something serious is going on. There's, of course, the scientists are saying similarly about the biosphere.
Yeah.
I don't know how we can head off this convergence of the economic problems, the biospheric problems, social problems, war. Any optimistic view that's rational in there? Is there anything? I mean,
I'm clinging by my fingernails.
What are you clinging to? Right.
Okay. If we look back, I do a little bit of other stuff apart from economics sometimes, because economics has to be firmly embedded in who we are as a species and what we are as an ecosystem. You know, economics is fundamentally in that respect a natural science. You know, I could argue, for example, that the whole of economic history, from Adam Smith, the whole theory of economics is founded on fossil fuels, and we have not worked out how we migrate to an economic paradigm where we don't have fossil fuels. Economics hasn't worked that out yet. At the moment, it's still clinging on to the idea that somehow we'll still have this cheap, abundant energy that our entire economic development over the last 200 years has been based on. Well, we aren't going to, and we haven't worked out how we're going to do it. That's the kind of thinking that we need. I'm not very into the degrowth argument, but I do think we need to kind of step out and say, what are we here for? What is our purpose on this planet? Because there's only one of this planet, and there's only one of us. We are the dominant species. Every dominant species in anthropological in the Earth's history has overbalanced, has gone too far, and has eventually been wiped out by some kind of climate event. Every time. We talk about the dinosaurs, but there's some evidence that they were already on the verge of extinction even before the asteroid hit, and certainly previous mass extinction events where the dominant species has been all but wiped out have been caused by some kind of climate change. I'm clinging by my fingernails to the idea that we might be intelligent enough to see that this is happening to us and do something about it so that we actually survive.
Thank you so much for your time.